how far this argument of, well, I'm doing a mitzvah, I'm on a mission from God, and so therefore I can do whatever I want, right? Yeah, it's a longer discussion, but people who think they're on a mission for God can sometimes justify anything, right? Okay. So he says, let's see. So it sounds like from the Ritva, he says that it's only for Limud HaTorah. That's what he was saying yesterday. And therefore, it doesn't seem like you can say, as the Beit Yosef does, that it's for any mitzvah purpose. It sounds like from the Ritva's opinion that it doesn't just apply to teaching children Torah, which is a special sort of classification unto itself, so that you ensure that the Torah is not forgotten, but rather it's teaching Torah to any segment of the Jewish people. The Takanas Yehoshua ben Gamla Kalala Gam Midrash Laharbitz Torah Olidrash Bolarabim, because when the Mishnah extols the special remedy that Yehoshua ben Gamla made for the Jewish people by setting up academies of study, according to the Ritva, it's not just for children, it's for adults as well. But according to the Ritva's argumentation, tzedakah is not teaching Torah. And therefore, the argument that, well, I'm doing a mitzvah by letting people line up at my doorstep and come collect tzedakah or set up a soup kitchen or whatever it is, that would not be included in the mitzvah of harbatzas Torah, of teaching Torah. V'imkein divrei habeis Yosef tzarachiyun shehish v'dasa Torah laharitva. And therefore, it's difficult to understand why the Beis Yosef thinks that the Ritva, who is limiting himself exclusively to teaching Torah, can be aligned with the Tur, who seems to say that for any mitzvah, you can do whatever you want with impunity. Shuv matzasi b'knesses hagdola b'hagos Beis Yosef os aleph dikpar hirgish b'zeh v'kosav v'zeh l'shano. And I noticed that this is the Knesses Hagdola, who's a commentary in the Beis Yosef, is disturbed by this. Amar ha'me'asef ro'eani deharitva poligal rabbeinu bal haTorah. He says, it seems to me that the Ritva and the Torah do not agree. Shadas Rabbeinu duhu adin b'chol mili de mitzvah b'chol mitzvah sheyiyah. Avol mitoch divrei Ritva zal yishlam delav b'chol mili de mitzvah ela b'midrash l'Torah shelo tishtakach Torah b'chulei. And he just basically, he ends the quote by basically saying that this is exactly what the Knesses Hagdola is arguing, that there is a difference of opinion between the Ritva and the Torah. And therefore, you cannot say that everyone's in agreement that it's for any mitzvah. And the truth is that there are other Rishonim who do not hold like the Torah, who says that for any mitzvah you can do it with impunity. You can operate with impunity. V'hainu Rashi v'haramban k'moshe hirgish habeis Yosef v'habachayin sham. V'Rabbeinu Yerucham ben Siv Lamed Aleph Kasav the Sofer Masa the Isa B'Gemar the Yicholim la'akiv alav. Hainu shekosev Shtari Mekachu Memkar Shtari Ta'anas V'Chayotze Bahem. So, and also I refer you to Rabbeinu Yerucham. He says that one of the things that you can stop a neighbor from doing is being a scribe. And so in explaining that term, being a scribe, Rabbeinu Yerucham explains that this is a scribe who writes up contracts that are, basic business contracts. Aval Sofer Shekosef Svarim Dino Kimalami Tinoko Shel Yisrael. But if you have a scribe who's writing Jewish books, to be able to spread Torah knowledge to the masses, that's no different from a person who teaches children. Because of Alzeh Beis Yosef, the Chaynir Das Rabbeinu, the Habachol Mili de Mitzvah, who Kamar Shein Yicholim Limchos Biyado Ad Kan Devara. And the Beis Yosef writes that this is also consistent with the Torah, who says that any mitzvah that you're doing can be done with impunity. Ulam niralanias daiti da afshazen nachon da hatur svir like Rabbeinu Yerucham, ava Rabbeinu Yerucham lo svir like hatur. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely aligned, because maybe Rabbeinu Yerucham, who permits a scribe who's writing Torah literature does not provide as sweeping of a dispensation as the Torah does. Demimad de Kosav Rabbeinu Yerucham de Sofer Shekos Yisar Medinu Kimalamed Adain Eno Muchra Klal Lomer Duadin Bishar Mili de Mitzvah Kamot Tzedakah Denami Hadin Kain. Okay, and he uses the same argumentation that he used for the Ritva. Maybe only a scribe who is working on proliferating Torah knowledge and spreading it out to the world, maybe that's the dispensation, but not for any kind of profession where a mitzvah is involved. And he's going through a whole bunch of Rishonim now, and I'm not going to belabor the point. I just want to get to the bottom line. Okay. Okay. Because he's going through a real, very in-depth analysis of all of the different opinions. So I'm going to cut to the chase. This is obviously a lot of different shades of opinion as to what kind of mitzvahs you're allowed to engage in. Let's see here. Wow, this goes on for a really long time. Let's see if there's a bottom line over here. Bottom line is that we're going to stick with it. He doesn't really even come up with a summation of his argumentation. Ulasikam hadvarim. So, okay, yeah, he does. He does come up with a summation at the very end. Here we are. Ulasikam hadvarim hanira lanius daiti de'ein liftoach marpe'a o gan yeladim b'chatzer o binyan megorim b'li haskamat kol hashchenim. He says, it would seem to me, as in the final summation, based on all of the different opinions that we've seen, that you are not permitted to open up a medical clinic or a daycare center in a courtyard or in a shared building, let's say where you have multiple tenants, without the consent of all of the neighbors. Lo mibayi ladas Rashi Ramban Rashba Ritva Va'od Disvirlahu Darak Davar Shuhu Limud V'Harbatzas Torah Nichlal Bichlal Takanas Yeshua ben Gamla. This is not only true according to the whole litany of Rishonim, who feel that the only dispensation is provided for someone who's going to be teaching Torah, dispensing Torah knowledge. Ela af ladas haTorah b'Hashulchan Aruch Disvirlahu B'Chol Mitzvah Shari Mikol Makom Marpeya V'Gan Lo Nichlalu Bazeh K'Mevur Le'el. But even according to the Beis Yosef and the Torah, who hold that if any kind of mitzvah that you're doing is justification for you to do whatever you want with impunity, but that's got to be specific mitzvah activity that is recognized as religious activity. If it's something like opening up a clinic or a daycare center, that's not, because you could argue that everything that you do in life could be categorized as a mitzvah. So he says, Od ro'i laha'ir de gamhecha shal pi hadin ef shalimchot. He says, I also want to point out something else. He says that even in a situation where the neighbor says, I can work with impunity because I'm doing a mitzvah, and therefore you have no right to protest. Mikol makam hecha dechozer richishat hadira na'asa al pi chok hamedina. He says, but also you have to look at what the municipal law is based upon the law of the land. He says, if a tenancy and occupying space in a building is restricted by certain municipal rules or zoning, yesh levarer b'chol medina et chukah. You have to clarify what the law is where you live. Di'im al pi chok yachol la'akev, im kain hishtatfu adaita dahachi. And therefore, even if halacha allows a neighbor to work with impunity and open up what he wants, but if the municipality does not recognize it as legal, then essentially it's not even you utilizing dina de malchusa, but rather when you sign the contract to occupy that building, it was with the agreement and consent that you would abide by municipal law. So even you as a neighbor who wishes to open up a little yeshiva katana a little cheder in your apartment, when you signed the agreement to either purchase the condo or to lease the apartment, you did so with the understanding that you would abide by the rules of the municipality. And so if there's a rule in the contract or in the municipal code that says that you cannot open up a school in your apartment, then you have to abide by that. And therefore, the neighbors also have a right to prevent you from opening, even if you argue, I'm on a mission from God. Okay? So let's say, classic example, a guy out of the goodness of his heart wants to open up a charity center. So he wants to start a soup kitchen, or he wants to set up a clothing gamach, where people come in and out of his apartment at all hours of the day and the night to get food, to get clothing. It's a beautiful thing, right? Not if you're a neighbor. Not if you're a neighbor, it's not a beautiful thing, okay? So granted that according to one set of authorities in the Torah, you cannot stop the neighbor from doing that because he's engaged in a mitzvah. Mikol makom im alpi hachok yachol la'akev. But if the municipal code does not permit the establishment of a business like that in a private apartment, in kain hashutfus naase adaita dahachi, the rashai limchot al pi Torah. Then basically the partnership was constructed that when you agreed to become a tenant, you would abide by certain limitations, and therefore the other neighbor has a right to say you're not abiding by your part of the deal. In other words, there is a social contract when you live in an apartment building. There's a social contract when you live on a street. You know, the social contract is that you're not going to be boisterous, you're not going to be a nuisance, you're not going to create a hazard, and all of these other things. And so even if you could argue, well, I'm doing a mitzvah, how could you possibly, protest? Yes, you can, because that was the rule when you decided to come into the neighborhood or into the building. You agreed that you would abide by the rules of the neighborhood. Okay? So that's what he finishes with, and I think that's an important, really important point to underscore as well. Okay.
How does it work with different events? Like if you start out, if you're living in an apartment,
yeah,
you open up a cheder, and initially you've got like the rest of the tenants are giving value mark. Then there's a buy, could be different people who are moving to units.
Right.
And then they protest subsequent to coming into the building.
Right. So it would all depend on the municipal code. If the municipal code clearly prohibits that activity, you can't say, well, I've been doing it all these years, how could you stop me? The answer is, what is the rule? What does the contract say that you signed? And the fact that the other neighbors, notwithstanding that they didn't protest, that doesn't mean that I don't have a right to protest. So I think that argument would be hard to hold water. The mitzvah called is silent, and the guy's engaged in doing a mitzvah that's clearly falls under the category of religious activity. So then he could say, well, I side with the Torah, and the Torah says that you can't stop me from doing this because I'm doing a mitzvah. I can operate with impunity. And this is where you get into the machlokas. Does the impunity only mean when you're teaching Torah to children? Does it apply to only when you're teaching Torah, period? Or does it apply to other mitzvot like giving out tzedakah? Does it apply to a shul, right? To opening up a shtibel? Guy can say, well, I mean, this is really the controversy. You got a guy who guts a house out, turns it into a shul, creates a lot of extra traffic on the street, foot traffic, automobile traffic, and so forth. Does a neighbor have a right to complain? And the answer seems to be, it depends, right? If he's abiding by the zoning laws, then it could be that you don't have a right to protest. If he's abiding by every single law, but you are inconvenienced by the fact that more people are parking on the street, well, you don't own the street. You can't stop a person from making a social gathering in their home and doing whatever they want in their home, as long as they're abiding by the law. But if indeed the municipal code says you cannot establish a house of prayer in a private home, and I don't know what those zoning laws are in Thornhill, I have no idea. But if that indeed is the law, then you would be allowed to bring action against the neighbor who is creating this added traffic and noise and inconvenience to the neighborhood, because he's not abiding by the social contract that all the neighbors agreed to when they move into that street or that neighborhood. Okay, so, and obviously it's a subjective thing, right? Okay, so
Does it make a difference whether the complainant is Jewish or not?
No, it shouldn't make a difference at all. In other words, I don't side with those people who try to make other Jews feel guilty, because how can you protest against a shul? How can you protest against a gemach, right? You know why? Because I live on this block, and it's reduced my quality of life, and you don't know what's going on in my home, why this is creating an added nuisance for me, and perhaps it's creating shalom bias problems and creating problems for my kids. You don't know what the situation is, so I don't agree to that kind of line of argumentation that a person should feel guilty, right? It's there has to be some accommodation and some resolution or some negotiation that the neighbors can come to. Even the Jewish neighbors should be able to come to a person who wants to open up a shul on the block. If he's in violation of the code and it really is creating a nuisance, so then, and the guy who's opened the shul is not willing to limit himself in any way, is not willing to work with the neighbors, so then let them throw the book at him. Let them get the authorities involved. Obviously, everyone has to try and be reasonable and work things out whenever they can, but you have to know that the law is on the side of the halacha, is on the side of a neighbor who has a right to protest if a person has violated the municipal code. Okay.
So, Rabbi, would you have to take someone to a beis din, or could you go to the courts over that, the secular courts?
Well,
is that another topic?
It may be another topic. I don't know how to resolve it. You would be there's nothing wrong with complaining to the zoning board or whatever that body is, the government body is that controls that regulates zoning. You don't have to take them to a beis din before you complain to the.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Whether or not, if it has to go to litigation, at that point, what do you do? Whether you have to go to beis din or not is something I think that would have to be examined on an individual case.
I know of people like schools that are in the middle residential areas, Thorn Hills, plus centers are in the same sort of situation. It doesn't seem like anything's happening as far as like that I've ever read or heard of situations where the authorities really try to push the envelope of closing them down or doing something about it.
Well,
It
I
could,
have some experience with that, and yeah, they really push back. But it depends how resilient you are. If you really want to do it and you have the support of the community, uh, you stay. But it's hard. It's really, really hard because the Jewish neighbors are the worst. If compare, if you really want to do it, because they know exactly what you're trying to do. So even the non-Jewish are more easygoing with us. But this is for past experience that I had here in Konogi. I have to deal with the police every day. I have to deal with the city every day. And the non-Jewish neighbors were like, they were complaining, but not so bad like the Jewish ones. So, but they really push back. The city really push back, and they give you fines, and they give you, they're always bugging you until they get tired too. So it depends who is.
could be more of attrition, yeah.
Yeah.
We had in our neighborhood. When Franklin opened up, and next door to Franklin used to be a church, and then a Russian school took it over. A non-religious school took it over. We protested because when the church was here, it was nice and quiet. We had a playground on Sunday, and then now it's a Chabad, it's a children's school, and you open your window. I happen to like the sound of kids playing, but it's constant. The kids are screaming and enjoying themselves.
Right.
What can you do?
Right. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to sympathize with a person who tries to prevent a school from opening up, right? As Izzy portrays. But you have to, that has to be measured against what the zoning allows for. And usually you come to some kind of compromise. Okay, so we're in the middle of this halacha that says that you have to be careful not to cause damage from your actions to a neighbor or to the members of a Rishus Harabim, ela imkain mochel lo shchena, unless your neighbor is willing to be mochel, and we'll just go to the next part, ushatika hi kemechila. And then the Rav Shulchan Aruch says that a neighbor's silence is a tacit consent to allow you to remain. You don't have to get active approval as long as the neighbor is silent. That is allowed to be interpreted halachically as approval. Ela im kain yadua she'eino mochel b'leiv shalem, unless it is known clearly that the neighbor is unhappy. In other words, if a neighbor has made comments to his other neighbors, I'm really not happy that this place is opened up. The fact that they haven't complained to the guy who opened up the gemach himself is not proof of the fact that he consents, because he's made his mind clear. There are sometimes people are what's the word? They have an aversion to confrontation. Yeah, that's a very Canadian trait, to have an aversion to confrontation, right? You've noticed that too, Mordechai? So you try to figure out a different way to you express your displeasure to others without approaching the person who is the source of the irritation. Okay, which
it's like the joke at the restaurant where the guests complain to each other, and then when the waiter comes and says, "How are things?" everyone says, "Oh, it's fine, thank you, wonderful."
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, no, that's very Canadian.
Yeah, it's actually can sometimes be very harmful. It could do a lot of harm because, of course, this could cause, first of all, sometimes people would want to know how you feel if you're not happy with them. And it's not, and also it contributes to a lot of lashon hara, right? Because essentially what ends up happening is the person's so dissatisfied that they can't bring themselves to confront the individual head on, that they tell everybody how unhappy they are, except the person themselves. And that's not permitted according to halacha either, right?
Interesting.
So
I've never seen that side of the coin. That's fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, sure, of course. So ela im ken yadua she'eino mochel b'leiv shalem. So unless you know for a fact that if his silence is based on the fact that he's confrontation averse, you cannot use his silence as tacit approval, because you know that he's spoken to every other neighbor and told them how unhappy he is. Umechila umatana she'ena b'leiv shalem eina klum. And as we know, any kind of consent or gift that is not made with a complete heart does not count halachically as a consent. Okay, so that's the reason why you have to make sure that the neighbors are okay with the activity. And then he writes, "V'nezek shel b'nei rishus harabim ein yecholes limchol ela biyad zayin tovei ha'ir b'mamad anshe ha'ir." And then he writes that when it comes to damage that is caused by an individual to the public, so that's something, how can you get consent from the public thoroughfare if you're creating a nuisance or potential interference with the activities of the public? Who can be mochel? Who can consent to your interference? So that can only be done by what's called the 7 overseers of the city, with a town hall meeting or a city council meeting where the public is invited to attend. And it used to be that Jewish towns they would set up 7 council members, but it doesn't have to be specifically 7. It could be basically, as long as the city council provides their approval or their they give you some kind of exception to allow your activity to commence on a public area where even though your activity is potentially infringing on public access and things like that, if the city council gives you the right to do it, that's the only way that you would be able to receive consent. And the city council would have to pass that legislation in the presence of the public. In other words, they would have to have a public hearing. And imochalim beferish, so as long as they explicitly give you permission, then it's okay. So I think we'll hold it here. We'll finish the language of the Rav Shulchan Aruch tomorrow. Okay, and we're getting more and more people live, everybody. Just wanted to let you know.